12 traits emotionally intelligent people share. You can learn them. Imagine two people sitting in the exact same executive boardroom. Both hold master's degrees from elite universities. Both scored in the top 2% on standardized cognitive testing. Their raw intelligence, their IQ, is virtually identical. Yet 5 years into their careers, their trajectories look wildly different. Curious. One is thriving, leading cross-functional teams, navigating complex political shifts within the organization, staying calm under extreme pressure, and consistently inspiring those around them. The other is stuck, frequently involved in misunderstandings, prone to explosive outbursts when projects stall, frustrated by an inability to influence others, and wondering why their brilliant technical ideas keep getting ignored. Surprised. Why does this happen? For decades, our educational institutions and corporate hiring practices operated under a single, deeply flawed assumption that cognitive capacity is the ultimate predictor of human achievement. We measured logic, memory, and spatial reasoning, believing these traits determined who would lead and who would lag. But modern neuroscience and behavioral psychology tell a vastly different story. When researchers examine top performers across hundreds of global organizations, raw cognitive ability accounts for only about 20% of the factors that determine success. The remaining 80% comes from a distinct set of human capabilities: how we handle stress, how we perceive unspoken social cues, how quickly we recover from failure, and how deeply we connect with the people around us. Consider what happens inside your brain during a sudden crisis. A crucial client threatens to walk away, or an unexpected personal loss hits. Long before your rational prefrontal cortex can process the data, an ancient almond-sized structure deep within your limbic system, the amygdala, scans for threats. It threatens to hijack your rational thought, flooding your body with cortisol and adrenaline. In that single, fragile second between a trigger and your reaction lies the defining test of human capability. One person reacts out of raw impulse, damaging trust and blowing up relationships. Another pauses, notices the physiological surge, regulates the impulse, and responds with deliberate, strategic clarity. That single second isn't governed by your IQ. It is governed by emotional intelligence, or EQ. And here is the most transformative discovery of modern brain science. While your IQ remains relatively static after adolescence, your emotional intelligence is remarkably malleable. Thanks to neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong ability to form new neural pathways, the emotional habits you display today do not have to be the habits you display tomorrow. Emotional intelligence is not a genetic trait written into your DNA at birth. It is a trainable, refinable set of behavioral competencies. Over the next few minutes, we will unpack the 12 foundational traits that emotionally intelligent people share, and more importantly, how you can systematically build each one into your daily life. Raw intellect acts merely as an entry-level threshold. Outstanding performance and transformative leadership are overwhelmingly driven by emotional competencies. Highly emotionally intelligent people master the gap between stimulus and response, keeping the brain's emotional center, the amygdala, from hijacking their rational mind, the prefrontal cortex. Empathy is not passive sentimentality or agreement. It is an active cognitive and emotional discipline that allows you to read unspoken social signals and adapt accordingly. The ability to recover quickly from failure requires adopting an internal locus of control and reframing setbacks as diagnostic feedback rather than personal flaws. Because of neuroplasticity, emotional skills can be intentionally learned, practiced, and wired into permanent habit loops at any stage of life. IQ will get your foot through the door of any prestigious institution, but it is emotional intelligence that decides how far into the room you actually get to walk, how long you stay, and whether people choose to follow you. For generations, society has operated under the persistent illusion that pure cognitive horsepower, the ability to solve complex logical problems, analyze massive data sets, and memorize intricate information, is the single greatest predictor of life success. We built entire school systems, corporate hiring frameworks, and promotional tracks around standard intellectual metrics. Yet, when we step into the real world and observe human performance under conditions of high stress, rapid change, and intense collaboration, that traditional model breaks down completely. In any given field, raw intellect acts merely as a baseline entry requirement, a threshold competency. To land a seat at the table in top-tier engineering, law, medicine, or corporate management, you must possess a high IQ. Everyone surrounding you in those environments meets that basic cognitive baseline. Once everyone in the room is equally smart, your intellectual capability stops being your primary competitive advantage. The differentiator shifts dramatically toward how you manage yourself and your relationships. This is where emotional competencies take over as the true drivers of exceptional performance, outstanding leadership, and long-term career progression. Consider what happens when a crisis hits an organization. The person with the highest IQ in the room may quickly figure out the technical solution on paper, but if they lack emotional self-control, they might panic, snap at colleagues, or shut down communication channels. Their technical brilliant idea becomes entirely useless because they lack the social and emotional channels required to communicate it effectively or build buy-in. Conversely, an individual with a high degree of emotional intelligence recognizes the rising anxiety in themselves and their team. They stay grounded, regulate their own stress response, listen actively to the unspoken fears of their colleagues, and communicate with clarity and empathy. They move people from a state of defensive panic into a state of creative problem solving. This dynamic explains why so many technical experts hit a career ceiling while others, who may possess average technical skills, ascend to high leadership roles. Getting hired is largely a function of hard skills, resume credentials, and cognitive testing, the classic domain of IQ. Getting promoted, however, is a profoundly relational process. Progression within any organization relies on your ability to navigate complex political landscapes, manage cross-functional conflict, inspire trust, build psychological safety, and influence people over whom you have no direct authority. None of those abilities are calculated by standard intelligence tests. They are governed by the neural circuitry of emotional intelligence. When executives evaluate who should lead a company into the future, they rarely look for the person who can crunch numbers the fastest. They look for the person who can remain composed under pressure, develop talent, handle failure with grace, and align diverse groups of human beings toward a shared vision. IQ opens the initial door of opportunity, but EQ builds the path to meaningful, sustained achievement. Between a stimulus and your response, there is a space, and within that space lies your power to choose how you react, your growth, and your ultimate freedom as a human being. The second core trait of emotionally intelligent individuals rests on mastering this precise, split-second micro-pause. To understand why this single moment is so critical, we have to look beneath the skull at the fundamental architecture of the human brain. We are equipped with two distinct systems for processing experience: an emotional brain and a rational brain. Long before our conscious analytical prefrontal cortex gets a chance to evaluate a situation, incoming sensory information passes directly through the limbic system, anchored by an ancient, almond-sized structure called the amygdala. The amygdala serves as our internal alarm system, constantly scanning our environment for physical threats or social dangers. When it perceives a threat, whether a sudden physical hazard or a sharp piece of critical feedback from a supervisor, it triggers a rapid physiological reaction. It floods the body with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, pulling blood away from the rational prefrontal cortex and preparing us to fight, flee, or freeze. This sequence, known as an amygdala hijack, evolved to keep our ancestors alive in the face of immediate physical danger. However, in modern daily life, where threats are far more likely to be social, professional, or psychological, this automatic response often works against us. It leads to explosive outbursts, defensive arguing, rash decisions, and words spoken in anger that destroy years of built-up trust in a matter of seconds. Emotionally intelligent individuals do not possess a brain without an amygdala. They experience the exact same initial rush of anger, fear, or frustration as anyone else. The crucial difference lies in what they do during the precise moment that physiological surge occurs. Rather than allowing the emotional impulse to bypass conscious thought and dictate their actions, they activate a intentional, practiced micro-pause. This pause may last only 2 or 3 seconds, long enough to take a deep breath, notice the sudden tightness in their chest, or acknowledge the internal urge to snap back defensively. By simply noticing the internal state without acting on it immediately, they allow precious seconds for the sensory information to travel up into the prefrontal cortex, bringing the rational mind back online. By inserting this brief buffer between the trigger and the action, you transition from a state of mindless reaction to a state of deliberate response. You reclaim control over your own agency. In that micropause, you ask yourself essential questions. What is the most effective outcome here? Is my immediate urge going to solve this problem or escalate it? What is the other person actually feeling right now? This simple intervention changes your entire trajectory in high-stakes conversations, tense negotiations, and unexpected personal crises. The micropause is not a passive suppression of your feelings, nor is it a sign of weakness or hesitation. It is an active exercise of emotional discipline, a high-level cognitive skill that prevents your evolutionary past from sabotaging your present success and preserves your long-term relationships. Empathy is far too often misunderstood as a soft, passive sentimentality or a simple sign of agreement with another person's point of view. In reality, modern neuroscience and behavioral psychology reveal that genuine empathy is an active, highly disciplined cognitive and emotional muscle that requires intentional exercise to build and maintain. To understand the true power of empathy, we must distinguish between its two primary dimensions: cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy is the capacity to intellectually understand another person's perspective, mental state, and thought processes. It is the ability to step inside another human being's worldview, recognize their underlying assumptions, and comprehend why they see a situation the way they do, even if you fundamentally disagree with their logic. Emotional empathy, on the other hand, is the capacity to physically and intuitively feel an echo of what the other person is experiencing, creating an immediate, visceral, human connection. Emotionally intelligent individuals do not rely on passive assumptions about what others are feeling. They actively engage their neural circuitry to sense unspoken social signals. When you interact with another person, their face, voice, posture, and pacing offer a constant stream of subtle data. Long before someone explicitly says, "I am overwhelmed" or "I feel insulted," their body language shifts. A slight tightening around the eyes, a brief quiver in the vocal tone, a crossing of the arms, or a sudden change in speech tempo all carry profound emotional information. The brain possesses specialized mirror neurons that automatically replicate these physical and emotional states within ourselves, allowing us to sense what another person is enduring. However, in our fast-paced, highly distracted world, most people are far too consumed by their own internal monologues and immediate agendas to notice these subtle signals. They listen merely to prepare their counter-argument, waiting for their turn to speak, rather than truly tuning in to the human being standing right in front of them. Building empathy as a muscle requires moving past superficial active listening tactics and committing to deep, focused attention. It demands that you temporarily quiet your own defensive ego, set aside your personal prejudices, and curiosity navigate the inner terrain of another mind. When you exercise empathy, you create psychological safety, a rare and crucial condition in which people feel safe enough to be authentic, admit mistakes, and share creative ideas without fear of harsh judgment or ridicule. Furthermore, exercising empathy does not mean abandoning your own boundaries or simply agreeing with whatever the other person desires. You can deeply understand someone's pain, frustration, or fear without endorsing their behavior or agreeing with their conclusions. By acknowledging their emotional reality first, you diffuse toxic defensiveness and open up space for rational negotiation, authentic connection, and collaborative problem solving. Empathy is not a soft skill. It is a vital perceptual instrument that allows you to accurately navigate the complex, unspoken terrain of human relationships. Resilience is often mistakenly viewed as a stoic, unyielding toughness, an ability to absorb punishment like an immovable wall without ever showing vulnerability. Modern psychological research shows that true resilience relies on emotional agility, which is the dynamic capacity to experience difficult thoughts and intense emotions without becoming paralyzed by them or swept away in their current. When setbacks occur, whether in the form of a failed product launch, a sudden career displacement, or a deep personal disappointment, the fundamental difference between those who crumple and those who rebuild comes down to how they process and frame the experience. Emotionally intelligent individuals do not suppress their grief, frustration, or fear. They acknowledge those painful states fully, but they maintain an internal locus of control that keeps them from viewing themselves as helpless victims of external circumstances. At the core of emotional agility is the ability to shift your explanatory style, the habitual way you explain negative events to yourself. Unhelpful patterns of thought tend to frame setbacks using what psychologists call the 3 Ps: personal, pervasive, and permanent. When something goes wrong, an emotionally fragile response concludes, "This is entirely my fault because I am incompetent. My whole life is ruined, and things will never get better." An emotionally agile individual counters this self-defeating spiral by reframing the exact same event. They treat negative outcomes not as a final judgment on their personal worth, but as diagnostic feedback containing valuable data. They isolate the problem, recognizing that while a specific project failed or a strategy missed its target, the failure is temporary, specific to that situation, and a powerful teacher for future iterations. This cognitive shift prevents an emotional setback from metastasizing into chronic hopelessness. Instead of getting trapped in a loop of self-blame or external bitterness, emotionally intelligent people ask constructive questions. What can this experience teach me? Which variables were within my control, and which were entirely outside of it? What is the very next meaningful action I can take right now? By focusing their mental energy strictly on what they can influence, they activate the brain's problem-solving networks rather than remaining trapped in a passive stress response. They accept the discomfort of the present moment while holding a steady, long-term belief in their ability to adapt and eventually overcome the obstacle. Furthermore, emotional agility allows you to navigate life with a high degree of psychological flexibility. Rather than clinging rigidly to plans that are clearly no longer working, resilient people hold their goals firmly, but their methods loosely. They are willing to feel the temporary sting of letting go of an outdated strategy, admitting an error in judgment, or starting over from scratch. They understand that pain and difficulty are natural elements of any ambitious life, not signs that something has gone fundamentally wrong. By greeting setbacks with curiosity rather than despair, and by viewing their own emotional distress as a temporary signal rather than a permanent state, they turn moments of adversity into fuel for deeper wisdom, personal growth, and renewed momentum. For centuries, standard medical and psychological doctrine held that the human brain became essentially fixed and unalterable once a person reached adulthood. We operated under the bleak assumption that the emotional habits, behavioral reactions, and personality quirks you developed in childhood and early adolescence were permanently written into your neural hardware for the rest of your life. Modern neuroscience has completely dismantled this rigid myth, replacing it with one of the most empowering discoveries of our time: neuroplasticity. The human brain remains dynamic, adaptable, and structurally plastic throughout our entire lives. It is constantly reshaping its physical architecture, rewiring its synaptic connections, and strengthening specific neural pathways in direct response to our repeated thoughts, intentional focus, and daily behaviors. This neuroplastic reality fundamentally changes how we must view emotional intelligence. EQ is not an innate, unchangeable genetic lottery ticket handed to you at birth. You are not simply born an empathetic person or a short-tempered person, destined to remain that way forever. Emotional intelligence is a sophisticated suite of learnable competencies grounded in physical brain structures. Every single emotional reaction you have forms a pathway in the brain. When you regularly give in to sudden anger, indulge in defensive arguments, or retreat into passive-aggressive silence, you are repeatedly firing specific neural circuits, making those unhelpful responses faster, more automatic, and harder to break in the future. Conversely, every single time you consciously choose to interrupt an old habit loop by taking a deep breath during a moment of panic, pausing to listen to someone you disagree with, or actively reframing a failure, you are physically weakening the old destructive pathway and building a new, more adaptive neural circuit. The mechanism behind this transformation relies on conscious practice and deliberate attention. Psychologists often sum up neuroplasticity with the fundamental phrase, "Neurons that fire together, wire together." When you deliberately practice an emotional skill, such as accurately naming your feelings or exercising empathy during a tense conversation, you activate the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function and conscious decision-making. Through consistent repetition, the prefrontal cortex builds stronger, faster connections to the deeper limbic regions of the brain, allowing you to regulate emotional impulses with increasing ease and speed. What initially requires immense conscious effort and self-control gradually transforms into a natural, effortless habit. This process of neural rewiring demands patience, intentionality, and self-compassion, because the brain naturally seeks the path of least resistance, favoring long-established emotional habits even when those habits are harmful. Rebuilding your emotional response patterns is very much like carving a brand new walking trail through a dense forest. The first few trips require significant effort to clear the overgrown path, but with consistent daily travel, the trail becomes smooth, clear, and easy to navigate. Age, past trauma or decades of ingrained behavior do not limit your capacity for growth. The brain you have today is simply the cumulative product of where you have directed your attention and practice in the past. And the brain you will have tomorrow depends entirely on the deliberate emotional choices you choose to make right now.